Hello everyone, and welcome back to WhisperedWraiths. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, please let me know in the comments if you are liking my stories, and don't forget to like the video and subscribe the channel. Story 1. The Abandoned Hospital, a doctor's ghost still roams. Arrival at Stonevale Memorial. Ryan pushed against the rusted iron gate, its hinges screeching like nails on a chalkboard as it resisted his effort. The sound echoed through the deserted grounds of Stonevale Memorial Hospital, sending a shiver through the group. Beyond the gate, the hospital loomed, a hulking corpse of brick and decay, silhouetted against a bruised evening sky. Its shattered windows gaped like rows of jagged teeth, gritting mockingly down at them. For a moment, none of them spoke. The air was dense and cold, smelling of wet earth and something sharper, like old rot lurking beneath the surface. Claire's camera light cut through the creeping gloom, her beam flickering erratically as though reluctant to reveal what lay ahead. Its glow caught glimpses of nature reclaiming the land. Vines curled greedily over the hospital walls, their leaves pressing against shattered windows as though trying to get in. Weeds strangled what remained of the pathway, their roots crawling like long dead fingers reaching toward anyone bold enough to enter. "Welcome to our haunted mansion," Logan joked, though his voice carried none of his usual bravado. He kicked at a crack in the pavement where weeds sprouted. The sound of his sneakers scraping stone echoed oddly, too sharp and too loud. "Not funny, Logan." Jess's voice trembled, and she gripped Ryan's sleeve for reassurance. Her wide eyes flitted nervously toward the shadowy building. "This place already feels wrong." Claire swung the camera around to capture her face, the lens zooming in for dramatic effect. "We are about to uncover the truth behind the legend of Dr. Asher Voss," she intoned with exaggerated eeriness. "For decades, rumors of the disgraced doctor's spirit have terrified anyone brave enough to set foot in this abandoned hospital. Tonight, for the first time, we will investigate the very operating rooms where his monstrous experiments reportedly took place." "Cut the ghost tour nonsense, Claire," Ryan muttered, annoyance creeping into his voice. His breath clouded faintly in the cooling air, and his knuckles whitened around the flashlight he held. "This is just an old building. We get the footage, make fun of Logan for chickening out first, and get out." "Dream on, Ryan," Logan snapped, a defensive edge to his tone. He stuffed his hands into his hoodie pockets and stared hard at the hospital, as if trying to prove he wasn't fazed, yet the twitch of his jaw gave him away. With reluctant steps, they moved toward a crumbling side entrance. The thick door hung lopsided on broken hinges, as though it had been forced open long ago by someone or something desperate to get inside. Jess stopped short at the threshold, her breath catching as a gust of frigid air met them, far colder than it had been moments earlier. "Okay, seriously?" she stammered, watching her breath mist and swirl like smoke. "Why is it so cold?" Ryan shook his head, but his expression betrayed his unease. "Old places get cold at night, that's all." His words sounded unconvincing, even to himself. They stepped over the crumbling threshold and into the hushed darkness of the hospital. Immediately, the silence was suffocating, as though the building had taken a sharp, collective breath at their arrival. Claire's camera light flicked left to right, sweeping across walls marred with water stains and peeling paint that curled like dying skin. Decades of decay lay strewn across the floor, moldy medical files disintegrating into piles of mush, rusted IV stands that listed sideways like broken skeletons, and cracked tiles that gleamed faintly under the light. Ryan led the way with deliberate steps, his flashlight trembling just slightly in his hand. Each movement sent echoes bouncing down the long hall, ricocheting back to them like ghostly whispers. In the dim glow, shadows swirled and stretched across the hallway, distorted by the beams of their lights. Everything, the silence, the cold, the heavy air, felt oppressively wrong. "The operating rooms are probably upstairs," Ryan said, his voice just above a whisper, as though speaking louder would wake something sleeping beneath their feet. "Second floor is usually where surgical theaters are." Logan snorted weakly. "Who cares where they are? We'll take a look, prove nothing's here, and leave." Claire, always eager for a shot, turned the camera on him with a grin. "Admit it, Logan, you're scared." Logan whipped his head around to glare at her. "No," he said sharply, though the pitch of his voice betrayed him. Before Claire could tease further, a sudden echoing clang rang out from deep inside the building, a sound like metal dropping against stone. They all froze. Jess clutched Ryan's arm tighter, her nails digging in. "Please tell me one of you heard that," Logan said, his eyes wide as he scanned the darkness. Claire didn't respond, but the camera light quivered in her hands as she turned it toward the hallway ahead. Beyond the glow, shadows rippled and seemed to shift, impossibly alive. Ryan's voice broke the silence, low and strained. "Let's just keep moving." And so, deeper into Stonevale they went, step by cautious step, as the yawning dark swallowed them whole. The whispers begin. They found the stairs, a spiral of creaking iron that twisted upwards into the darkness like an unholy drill. The handrails were cold, slick with years of neglect, and each step groaned under their combined weight. It felt as though the hospital were alive and aware of its trespassers protesting their every movement. The stale air thickened with each upward step, carrying the scent of rust, mold, and something sour that no one wanted to identify. At the top, they found the first hallway stretched before them like a yawning maw. The blackened corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, filled with shadows deeper than night itself. It was unnervingly silent, broken only by their own unsteady breathing and the faint, irregular plink of water dripping somewhere unseen. Ryan gripped the flashlight tighter, sweeping its dim beam across cracked walls and broken doorways. "Let's get this over with," he muttered, his voice too loud for the suffocating quiet. That was when they heard it, a soft, rhythmic sound. Squeak, pause, squeak, cutting through the silence like fingernails scraping glass. It was distant but unmistakable, the sound of a wheel slowly rolling down the hall toward them. Jess froze mid-step, her breath hitching audibly. What was that? "Probably just a rat pushing an old gurney," Ryan joked, though the quiver in his voice betrayed his forced bravado. His flashlight wavered in his shaking hand. Claire wasn't laughing. She squinted into the darkness, swinging the camera light toward the sound. Its beam scanned the hall like a thin knife, cutting through black fabric. For just a moment, her light caught movement, something shifting at the very edges of her beam, too quick to identify. "Did you see that?" Claire whispered, her pulse hammering in her ears. "No," Ryan snapped, his voice low and sharp. "Keep moving. Don't get spooked." Jess clutched her arms through herself as they walked. "The sound's still there," she muttered. And indeed, the soft, wheel creaking continued, steady now, and following them. A shiver crept up her spine with every step. Claire turned her head sharply and froze. Her flashlight illuminated a hospital bed sitting crooked in the center of the hallway, rusted and broken. The dull metallic frame was crusted with dark stains, its peeling leather restraints hanging limply off the sides. That wasn't there before," Jess stammered. Her voice came out thin, strangled by fear. "There's no way someone moved that silently," Logan whispered, his face pale as he backed away, every muscle visibly tense to flee. Claire swallowed hard, her camera still recording. She stepped closer to the gurney, her instincts torn between curiosity and terror. A loose wrist restraint swung gently back and forth, as if someone had just slipped free of it. She didn't dare breathe as her light hovered over the bed's surface, now clearly showing greasy brown stains pooled along the seat. Too many stains. The flashlight flickered violently, plunging the hall into frantic bursts of darkened light. Then unmistakably, something else joined the sound of the bed's swaying straps. A whispering murmur slithered out of the walls. At first, the words sounded faint, unintelligible, a chorus of gibbering madness. Then it grew louder, closer, though no mouths appeared to speak it. The voices were neither male nor female, but layered, chaotic, and wrong. Logan's breathing quickened. Nope, I'm done. Screw this." Without another word, he turned and bolted down the hallway, shoes pounding against tile as he sprinted toward a door on the left. "Logan, wait!" Claire shouted, but he was already gone. The whispers swelled again, louder, and Jess broke. "Oh my God, we need to leave. Logan, Logan!" She cried out and ran after him. Ryan close on her heels, stumbling over debris in his rush. Claire lingered a moment longer, still staring at the gurney. She could have sworn she saw impressions in the leather. Fingers, 5 elongated shapes, sinking into the stained surface like invisible hands pressing down. Before her eyes, the imprints slowly curled into fists, then stopped moving entirely. Claire staggered back, nearly dropping her camera. Her heart hammered violently, each beat slamming into her ribs. A noise like shuffling footsteps echoed from behind her. "Guys," her voice cracked. No response. A sudden burst of cold air swirled past her, and Claire turned, blood pounding in her ears. "Guys, wait for me!" Her legs finally obeyed her terror as she scrambled to follow. Vanishing through the same door Logan had disappeared into. As her footsteps faded, the hallway fell silent again. The gurney's leather strap swayed one last time before stopping mid-swing. The operating theater. The next room was larger than the others. A massive operating theater with rows of crumbling, dusty seats, fanning upward in tiers like an auditorium for the dead. The broken remains of hanging lights swayed ever so slightly in the icy air, as if disturbed by an unseen hand. Moonlight streamed down through shattered skylights, bleeding pale silver light across the scene below. In the center of the theater stood an operating table, draped in a tattered, yellowed sheet. Rusted surgical tools were scattered everywhere. Scalpels, rib spreaders, bone saws, all of them encrusted with black stains that hadn't faded with time. The tools had been left as though someone had been interrupted mid-procedure, preserved in their macabre chaos. "Jesus," Ryan muttered under his breath, sweeping his flashlight around the vast space. The beam landed on Logan, hunched at the far end of the room, racing against a crumbling wall. Logan was pale, chest heaving as sweat dripped down his brow. Ryan's voice echoed across the abandoned hall. "Are you insane? What the hell was that about? Running off like that?" Logan jerked his head up, his wide eyes rimmed with panic. There was something behind me. I swear to God I heard it breathing, right in my ear." His voice quivered as he glanced around like he expected something to crawl out of the shadows. Jess stayed close to Ryan, trembling as her eyes darted nervously to every corner of the massive room. "We shouldn't be here," she whispered hoarsely, her fingers clenched around the flashlight. "It's not safe. None of this is—" Before she could finish, the heavy door to the operating theater slammed shut. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot, and the group jumped. The sound had no warning, no breeze, no footsteps. It just happened. They spun around to stare at the door. Jess screamed, "No! No, no, no!" She bolted for it and yanked at the handle, her breath hitching. The knob rattled under her desperate hands, but it didn't budge. "It won't open! Why won't it open?" Her voice rose in pitch, nearly hysterical. Ryan approached slowly, trying to mask his own terror. "It's probably warped. Old buildings like this shift over time. Doors stick." But even as he said it, they all heard the sound that proved him wrong. A faint, gurgling laughter rippled through the room. It echoed through the stone walls, vibrating through the still air. It wasn't human, not entirely. The chuckle was wet and deep, like it gurgled out of lungs soaked with decay. Claire's hands shook as she lifted the camera, whispering, "It's just old acoustics maybe, right?" But even as she said the words, her voice cracked with disbelief. Ryan's flashlight flickered and sputtered. When the beam steadied, it landed on the operating table. At first, nothing seemed different, until Jess let out a strangled gasp. A figure now stood beside the table, tall, thin, unnaturally so. It wore a pale doctor's coat, filthy with dark stains trailing across its front. The coat's white fabric rippled slightly as though it too were breathing. Then the flashlight fell on its face, or what was left of it. The figure's eyes were gone, black voids so deep they seemed to suck the light itself into them. The mouth was wide, far too wide, stretching upward into a distorted, horrible grin that showed no teeth, just a cavernous darkness. In its skeletal hand, it gripped a rusted bone saw. Ryan staggered backward, dragging Jess with him as she stifled a scream with both hands. The figure didn't move, it simply watched, yet its presence pressed down on them like an unbearable weight. The silence shattered with an ear-piercing screech. The figure dragged the bone saw against the metal table, the sound sending shivers up their spines as it echoed violently across the operating theater. Sparks spat where rust met steel. Then, ever so slowly, the figure took a step forward. Claire screamed, her camera tumbling to the ground. "Run!" Ryan hissed, snapping into motion. "Run! Now!" The group bolted, Logan already in the lead as his shoes slapped against the tile floor. Jess sobbed softly as she ran, her flashlight jerking wildly across the walls. Claire didn't look back as she scrambled to pick up her camera, sprinting behind the others and diving through the nearest door into the dark labyrinth of hallways. As they vanished, the screech of metal and the gurgling laughter followed them, clawing at their ears even as they fled. Chased through the darkness. They ran blindly, the pounding of their feet matching the frantic rhythm of their hearts. But behind them, steady, deliberate, came another sound, the unmistakable thud of boots on the crumbling tile. Dr. Asher Voss. The hallways of Stonevale twisted and turned in a cruel labyrinth, each corridor identical to the last. Peeling walls, black mold oozing down like veins, old doors groaning in their hinges. They rounded another corner, but the route only bled into more darkness. "Jess, keep moving," Ryan shouted, his voice ragged. Jess stumbled. She was sobbing now, hiccuping as she struggled to keep pace. I can't." Ryan grabbed her hand, practically dragging her forward. Claire, still clutching her camera with shaking hands, turned her head briefly to glance back. The worst mistake of her life. Through the lens of her camera, the figure of Dr. Asher Voss loomed in sharp focus. He walked, calm and unhurried, yet never falling far behind. His pristine, filthy coat trailed him like a funeral shroud. The jagged bone saw swung at his side, leaving faint streaks of something dark across the tiles. And his face, God, his face, that hollow grin, impossibly wide and empty, turned its attention directly to her. The camera lens crackled with static for a moment as Claire's breath caught in her throat. Then, as if summoned by his gaze, the light bulbs hanging above them shattered one by one with resounding pops. Each explosion sent shards of glass and showers of sparks cascading into the air, plunging the hallways into deeper blackness. "Claire, move, move!" Logan bellowed. Claire snapped out of her trance, the weight of the darkness shoving adrenaline through her veins. She sprinted forward, her feet barely finding traction as the broken glass crunched beneath her shoes. The hallway twisted again, left, right, then left, turning the hospital into a puzzle they'd never solve. Ryan pulled Jess behind him, her gasp for breath echoing eerily against the walls. Behind them, boots thudded in patient pursuit. "He's still coming," Logan wheezed, glancing backward in sheer panic. "Why won't he stop? What the hell does he want?" "Keep running. He's toying with us," Claire shouted, desperation cracking her voice. They barreled into another hallway, a dead end. A rotting set of double doors loomed at the very end, but they were chained shut. Ryan skidded to a stop, nearly dragging Jess to the ground. "Not this, no, no," Ryan shouted, yanking at the heavy chains wrapped around the handles. "Do something," Jess wailed, tears streaking her dirtied face. Logan pounded his fists against the doors in frustration, the noise echoing off the surrounding walls like a scream trapped in time. Claire turned her flashlight behind them again, against every instinct begging her not to look. Down the long hall, at the very edge of the failing light, stood Dr. Voss, still, silent. The bone saw gleamed in the moonlight, filtering through cracks in the ceiling. A gurgling, bone-chilling laugh slithered from him, as if exhaled from deep inside his ruined chest. Then he moved, a single long step forward, and the temperature in the air plummeted like ice settling into their lungs. "Get those doors open," Claire shrieked, swinging her flashlight wildly. Ryan braced his foot against the door frame, yanking the chain with everything he had. Jess crouched beside him, fingers white-knuckled against the wall. Finally, with a snap, the brittle metal broke, the chains falling to the ground in a clattering heap. "Go, go, go!" Ryan screamed, shoving the doors open. They flooded into the room beyond, an empty ward. Old patient beds were lined against the walls, rusted springs exposed, sheets blackened with age. Dust hung thick in the air, disturbed only by their frantic entry. Claire staggered through last, slamming the doors behind her. She scanned the room with the flashlight beam, but her throat dried instantly. The room wasn't empty. From beneath each bed came faint, raspy breathing. Claire's light drifted down to one bed, shoes, peeking out from under the dust-riddled frame. Human shoes, old and decayed, and then they moved. The breathing grew louder. "Ryan," she choked. Before she could utter another word, the doors exploded inward with a terrible crash. Dr. Asher Voss entered slowly, his shadow crawling across the room like spilled ink. His hollow grin remained unbroken, the black voids of his eyes locked on his next victims. The group screamed as every bed in the room jolted violently. Patients, or the remnants of them, crawling out from beneath, their broken forms scraping against the floor as they rose to their feet, lost in the maze. Their footsteps thundered as they sprinted blindly through the endless twisting hallways. The air seemed to grow thicker, heavier with each hurried breath, like the walls were closing in around them. Ryan glanced back, his heart pounding painfully in his chest. Dr. Asher Voss, tall and ghostly in that blood-stained coat, was nowhere to be seen, but the faint sound of him dragging the bone saw against the tile floor echoed faintly through the gloom. "Where's the exit?" Jess cried, her voice teetering on the edge of panic as she clung desperately to Ryan's arm. "Where are we even going?" "Just keep moving," Ryan urged, his voice strained and hoarse. He wanted to sound strong, but the way his hands trembled told a different story. Claire, lagging slightly behind, tripped as the camera in her grip bumped against her leg. She stumbled forward, nearly dropping it, but Logan skidded to a halt and spun around to help her up. "We can't stop," Logan snapped, panting heavily as he dragged her to her feet. "Move, Claire." Pushing through yet another decrepit door, they tumbled into an open room, their flashlights bobbing across its vast, eerie emptiness. It was an old patient ward, sprawling and filled with rows of rusting iron beds covered in filthy, mildewed sheets. Dust swirled in the beams of light, illuminated by faint shafts of silver moonlight slicing through the shattered windows. The air here smelled of decay and age, thick and foul, like death lingering in the walls. "What the hell is this place?" Logan whispered, his voice reduced to hoarse rasp. Claire flicked her camera light toward the far corner of the room. The beam wavered and stuttered, and the group froze. One of the beds shifted. It was slight, almost imperceptible, but the tattered sheet covering it lifted for just a second, rising ever so slightly before it dropped back down, as though something underneath had just taken a breath, a shallow, unnatural breath. Jess let out a strangled cry, stumbling backward until she bumped into Claire. No, what the hell was that?" Ryan spun his flashlight across the ward, fear eating at his resolve. Then from the far end of the room, one of the beds screeched against the floor. The sound scraped through their ears like nails on glass. It wasn't alone. One by one, every single bed in the room began to move. Some rocked violently, metal wheels screeching and scraping as the frames shifted. Sheets slipped from rusted mattresses, landing silently on the dusty floor. Others shifted as though the forms beneath were rising, pulling against unseen restraints. The sound grew louder, crescendoing into a deafening cacophony. Claire turned, barely managing to keep her voice steady. "We need to?" Then it returned, the unmistakable sound of the saw, slowly, steadily dragging across the hallway floor just outside. Louder, heavier, more deliberate. Ryan turned toward the doorway, his flashlight shaking as it cut into the shadows. And there he stood, Dr. Asher Voss. He filled the frame of the doorway like a living shadow, towering, gaunt, and deathly still. His hollow sockets locked onto them with cruel focus, drinking in their terror. His mouth twitched, too wide, too knowing, before curling into a grotesque imitation of a smile. He tilted his head ever so slightly, as though studying them. Then, like a living nightmare, he took one step forward, his boots thudding heavily against the ground, the bone saw dragging along the door frame with a nails-on-metal screech. That sound shattered their paralysis. "Run!" Logan bellowed, his voice raw with fear. They bolted, shoving rusted beds aside as they raced for the emergency exit at the far end of the ward. Beds clanged and crashed behind them as if the very room had come alive, rattling with the fury of the forgotten. Jess reached the exit door first. She slammed against it, yanking desperately at the handle. "It won't open, it's locked." Ryan barreled forward, slamming his shoulder into the door as Logan joined him. Together they smashed into it again, and finally, with a deafening splintering crack, the door frame shattered. They stumbled through the opening, tumbling onto a set of stairs leading sharply downward. Ryan hit the ground hard, twisting as he pushed himself back up. He glanced upward, seeing Claire skid to a halt just inside the stairwell. Dr. Voss stepped into the ward, his figure framed in a haze of shadows and moonlight, his saw dangling heavily in his gloved hand. He did not chase them. He didn't need to. From somewhere within his chest, a deep and guttural laughter bubbled up, rolling across the ward like an inescapable tide. Claire staggered back, her camera shaking. "Go! Go!" The group stumbled down the stairwell, the oppressive laughter following them, unrelenting, into the dark depths of the hospital basement. The hospital basement. The air in the basement hit them like a damp, rotting blanket, heavy with mildew, and the faint, nauseating stench of stale blood. Water dripped from the exposed pipes overhead, creating an eerie rhythm as it splashed into stagnant puddles on the cracked concrete floor. Every sound, every breath, every nervous shuffle of feet echoed in the wide, empty expanse, the acoustics making them feel both larger and more vulnerable at the same time. Their flashlights seemed weaker here, their beams barely able to cut through the oppressive gloom. It was as though the very darkness resisted, thick and alive, clawing at the light. Claire steadied her camera, the weight of it almost unbearable now in her trembling hands. She kept the lens forward as her voice shook, barely audible over the steady drip, drip, drip from above. Did you hear him laughing just before we came down here?" Jess nodded, tears welling in her eyes but refusing to fall. "It's like he's enjoying this." Her whisper cracked, her words barely escaping her lips. "He's playing with us. This place shouldn't even exist," Logan muttered, his flashlight darting across the slimy walls. The light illuminated rusted medical cabinets lying haphazardly against the walls, old gurneys tipped at awkward angles, their wheels locked in eternal rust. Scraps of paper and ancient surgical instruments were strewn across the floor, each one more grotesque in its decay. Ryan motioned them forward, his jaw set tight. "Come on, we can't stay here. The stairs were the only way down. If there's another exit, we'll find it somewhere deeper." "Or we won't," Jess murmured grimly, clinging to his arm. Then Logan stopped abruptly, his flashlight fixed ahead. The others froze behind him. "What is it?" Ryan asked. Logan said nothing at first. He swallowed hard, then pointed with his light. There, against the far wall of the corridor, a door was slightly ajar, barely holding onto its rusting hinges. The faint outline of a plaque beside the doorway came into view, its once polished surface corroded beyond repair. Only one phrase was legible, etched deeply into the tarnished brass: "Surgical Theater, Sub-Level B." Jess gasped audibly, backing away as she shook her head. "No way we're going in there. You can't make me. I'm not walking into that." Ryan, breathing heavily, placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "We don't have a choice," he said, his voice grim. "He's behind us. He's blocking the stairs. There's nowhere else to go but forward." Jess trembled, her breaths coming in sharp bursts, but after a moment she relented, squeezing her eyes shut. "This place is a nightmare." Ryan reached for the door, gripping the edge with one hand, and pushed gently. The heavy door groaned like a dying animal, the rusted hinges screeching as the damp wood scraped against the concrete floor. Cold air rushed out from the room beyond, prickling their skin and carrying with it a sickly sweet odor, rotting meat and formaldehyde. The beam of Logan's flashlight swept inside, revealing rows of tarnished stainless steel counters and large surgical lamps that hung from the ceiling like dead chandeliers. Along the walls were countless jars filled with murky liquids, things suspended within them distorted by time and decay. Some of the jars were smashed, their contents now pooled in viscous stains across the counters. Ryan took a step inside, his flashlight tracking over the filthy floor. Old tools were scattered everywhere: bone saws, rib spreaders, rusty forceps, cloaked in grime and thick, dried smears of something unnameable. "This is not right," Claire muttered. Even her usually steely determination to document everything wavered. Her camera lens focused on the far corner of the room. There, illuminated faintly by Logan's light, was another operating table. Unlike the others, this one was pristine. It seemed untouched by time, the steel shimmering faintly, the leather straps unbroken. The dark surface reflected their flashlight beams in a way that made it seem wet, though there was no visible liquid. Ryan stepped closer, his throat tightened as he noticed something more horrifying. Deep gouges scratched into the table's steel edges, claw marks trailing across it in chaotic patterns. "Please, let's go, please," Jess whimpered, clutching her chest as tears streamed silently down her face. Then a sound broke through the tense silence. A faint click, 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 as though metal instruments were shifting behind them. Ryan turned quickly, his flashlight arcing wildly, but there was nothing there. The room was empty apart from the grotesque collection of tools and relics. Then they all heard it, a low, guttural exhale, like someone drawing breath after years of silence. The sound reverberated through the room, filling every corner, pressing against their ears and bodies like a physical force. "Run," Logan whispered, his voice breaking. But no one moved. From the far end of the room, the shadow appeared, vague at first, almost part of the darkness itself. But then it stepped forward, and Dr. Voss's haunting figure materialized, his empty eyes piercing their souls as his wide grin split his face in half. The bone saw hung loose in his gloved hand, dragging against the tiles with a metallic scrape. "Go!" Ryan shouted, his voice tearing through the momentary paralysis. They bolted through the surgical theater, shoving counters and medical trays out of their way. Dr. Voss's laughter rose behind them, wet and choking, an unbearable sound that would follow them into their nightmares. The final surgical room. The surgical theater in the sub-level was vast, its oppressive size swamping their senses. Cold, damp air clung to their skin, and the unsettling quiet magnified the creaks of their footsteps. The room was scattered with old medical equipment, rusted bone saws, scalpels, forceps, and surgical hooks, their surfaces thick with a layer of black, dried grime. Stains dotted the floor, likely remnants of long-forgotten procedures. It reeked of rot, a dark history no one had dared to revisit. Yet none of this frightened them as much as what they saw on the far wall. A mural, dark and grotesque, painted in thick, bloody streaks. It depicted a nightmare, a series of figures writhing in agony, their twisted forms wriggling helplessly under the hands of a shadowed figure standing over them. At the center of the painting was Dr. Asher Voss, his gaunt face staring directly at them. His hollow black eyes pierced their very souls. No matter where they stood in the room, those eyes seemed to follow their every movement, never blinking, never looking away. Claire recoiled in horror. How is this even possible? Her voice cracked with disbelief. She pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block out the dark implications of what they were seeing. Jess, who had been inching toward the door, abruptly stopped. The oppressive air seemed to press in on them all. "We need to leave," she whispered, her voice shaking with fear. "This place, it isn't just haunted, it's wrong." But the door behind her slammed shut with a deafening bang. Jess jumped back in terror as she pulled on the handle, but it was locked, a cold, final resistance. She tugged harder, heart racing, but it wouldn't budge. Ryan rushed forward, trying the door with no better results. His fist slammed against it in desperation, but the metal did not yield. "It's no use," he hissed, stepping away. He turned to the others. "We're trapped." Suddenly, the room's harsh silence was broken by a flickering light. The already dim lights above them flickered twice, then thrummed to life, casting a flickering, unnatural brightness over everything. The room seemed to come alive under the harsh light. It flickered wildly, then stabilized, burning as bright as daylight. From the center of the room, they heard a voice, smooth, cold, and haunting. "Who among you will be my next patient?" The voice was devoid of emotion, yet laced with something darker, something predatory. Each syllable slid like a whisper of death. The group spun as one, scanning the room with frantic eyes. Then, from behind the operating table, he appeared. Dr. Asher Voss. He stood tall, an imposing figure draped in a blood-stained surgical coat, the sleeves rolled up to reveal the twisted, thin bones of his arms. His face, pale and stretched unnaturally tight over his skull, was an empty mask devoid of human warmth. But his smile, too wide, too unnatural, tugged at the corners of his lips as he tilted his head toward them. His black, soulless eyes gleamed with a malevolent hunger. In his hand he held a gleaming bone saw, the metal glinting in the harsh lights like a predator's weapon. "You entered my theater," Voss murmured, his voice deepening with each word. "You wanted a show, didn't you?" Before they could respond, Claire's camera malfunctioned, crackling with static, and her shaky hands captured only fragments of the terrifying reality they were caught in. The distorted footage danced over Dr. Voss's eerie smile, but Claire's scream pierced the film, high-pitched and laced with terror, as the distorted image seemed to close in on them. For a moment, it felt like the room held its breath. The bone saw gleamed in Voss's hand as he slowly took a step forward. Each movement of his body seemed measured, deliberate, an animal cornering its prey. "You're in my domain now," he crooned, his voice smooth like silk, but underlaid with the weight of malice. "There is no escape." Then the air seemed to hum with a low vibration, as though the room itself were alive, suffocating them with its dark presence. "Who will be next?" Voss eased again, his voice echoing off the walls. The mocking smile never wavered. Slowly, he advanced. Claire, backed against a dusty cabinet, screamed, her voice choked with terror. Jess stumbled toward the far end of the room, desperately trying to open a rusted window that had no chance of opening. Logan shook, his breath catching in his throat, unable to make a sound. Ryan, his face pale, stood frozen, his flashlight flickering in his hand as he watched the dark figure of the doctor approach. With every movement of Dr. Voss, the world around them seemed to close in, the walls, the lights, the air, conspiring to keep them there, to keep them trapped in this unholy space. The door may have been locked, but now they felt locked in their fates, each one painfully aware that no one would leave this room alive. The lights flickered again, and the laughter from Dr. Voss rose slowly, cruelly, a deep, gurgling laugh that seemed to come from somewhere inside their bones, twisting with every echo until it felt like there was no escape from it. They realized the terrible truth. They were the final act in his theater of horrors. The lights buzzed, flickered one last time, and then all went dark. The escape. The room exploded in chaos. Every overhead surgical light burst with a deafening pop, scattering shards of glass down onto the floor. Dr. Voss, like a ghost, lunged forward with terrifying speed, his footfall silent as though he hovered just above the ground. The bone saw dragged through the air with a screech that rattled the nerves, sending shivers down their spines as the twisted doctor's wicked grin stretched even wider. Ryan didn't hesitate. Grabbing Jess's trembling hand, he shouted, "Move! Now!" His voice broke through the panic, urging her forward as they bolted toward the far end of the room. Ahead, they spotted it, a small maintenance door, half hidden in the shadows of the wrecked operating theater. Logan wasted no time kicking it open, a loud bang echoing in the hallway as he threw it wide. With no room for hesitation, the group stumbled into a narrow, dust-filled corridor, their shoes clattering on the uneven concrete as they fled into the darkness. Behind them, Dr. Voss's cruel laughter rang out, deep, guttural, and unrelenting, echoing off the walls like a twisted symphony. The sound rippled and shattered the stillness, sending a new surge of fear through them. "Go! Go! Go!" Ryan urged, his voice rising above the frantic pounding of their hearts. His flashlight waved uselessly ahead, unable to pierce the suffocating darkness of the never-ending hallway. But something was wrong. No matter how fast they ran, it felt like they were getting nowhere. The corridor stretched endlessly ahead, the same clinical doors passing them by, as if mocking their futile attempt at escape. Every door they passed seemed to lead them right back to the surgical theater, like an impossible loop. "This isn't possible," Logan shouted, his voice laced with panic as his legs grew heavier and his breath came in shallow gasps. He spun around, half expecting to see Dr. Voss appearing from one of the doorways, but instead, the doctor's form was at the far end of one of the corridors. Standing completely still, Voss's pale eyes locked onto them from the distance, a grotesque smile stretching too far across his face. There was no mistaking it. He had been anticipating their next move all along. "We need to find a way out," Claire cried, her voice choking on the terror that filled the air. With desperation clawing at them, they rushed toward another exit, an iron door at the end of the hall. Scratched across it were the words "exit," carved so deeply they seemed almost intentional. Ryan flung the door open, his breath catching as a cold gust of air rushed in, pushing past them like a final barrier. He shielded his eyes, his vision flooded with a harsh moonlight that blinded him as he stumbled forward. His pulse was pounding, blood rushing in his ears, making it feel like the hospital was still breathing down their necks. They emerged into the fresh night air, outside, free, or so it seemed. The air tasted sour and still, and for a brief moment it felt like the world was resetting itself, like all of it had been a nightmare. Jess's hand trembled as she clutched Ryan's sleeve, a cry building in her throat as she wiped the tears away. "Is he gone?" she whispered, hardly daring to believe they had made it out. Ryan looked behind them at the imposing shadow of Stonevale Memorial. It loomed silently in the dark, its windows like hollow eyes staring into the void, lifeless. For a moment, he allowed himself to breathe, only to stop in his tracks, his heart seizing. Above them, in one of the highest windows of the abandoned hospital, a tall, thin shadow stood, the faint gleam of a bone saw caught in the dim moonlight, reflecting off the glass like a signal. Dr. Voss's stitched smile, impossibly wide and cold, appeared behind the window. Slowly, he raised a hand and waved. A chill shot through Ryan's spine, paralyzing him in place. His breath caught in his throat. "We never really left," Logan whispered, his eyes wide with disbelief. Claire's camera, still clutched in her shaking hands, emitted a soft beep, indicating that the battery was nearly dead. But before they could speak, the screen fizzled with static, and the image vanished, replaced by an unsettling void of noise. Then, like the calm before a storm, a deep, hollow laugh echoed through the camera's mic. The screen went black, and there was no turning back. Epilogue. But even a week later, Claire uploaded the footage, her nerves still shaking, but her resolve ironclad. The video, titled "Ghost Found in Abandoned Hospital, Real Paranormal Experience," was a desperate attempt to share their harrowing journey, to warn others, but also to validate their terrifying experience. Claire had spent hours editing, combing through the footage for any clues, anything that could explain what happened. Her breath caught as she inserted the last frame, the haunting figure of Dr. Asher Voss waving from the window. As much as she wanted to believe it was just an illusion, just the tricks of an old building playing on their minds, she couldn't deny what they'd seen. The truth was still out there, raw and undisturbed in their minds. Within hours of uploading, the video went viral. Viewers reacted in waves. Some questioned its authenticity, calling it nothing more than a cleverly staged haunted house attraction. Others shared their own eerie experiences in similar abandoned places. They discussed the figure in the operating theater, the strange laughter, the movement in the dark corners. The debate raged on, gaining traction across social media platforms, forums, and videos. But it wasn't just the footage itself that captured attention. It was the intangible feeling that radiated through the screen, the discomfort, the unease that lingered in the air, even through the grainy, static-filled video. Thousands of viewers replayed the moments over and over, pausing at the chilling details, particularly the faint but unmistakable shadow moving behind the camera at the end when Dr. Voss's hollow eyes stared right through the screen. Was it real? Was it staged? The most chilling part of the video wasn't the footage at all, but the storm of comments flooding the section. As the number of views skyrocketed, viewers from all around the world tuned in, each offering their own thoughts. Some were sympathetic, suggesting that it had been a horrible experience, while others mocked it, playing off the ridiculous idea that a haunted spirit could have followed them out of the hospital. But then, there was one comment that stood apart, drawing attention from the masses. "You weren't alone in there. He followed you out." At first, Claire laughed it off as just another internet troll. There were always conspiracy theorists and pranksters trying to be the first to crack the case, to suggest that something sinister was still hunting her. But then it started, the creeping suspicion, the doubts that gnawed at her sanity as the days passed. She began to wonder if the commenter knew something no one else did. Claire dismissed the thought. Her mind didn't want to go down that dark path. But that night, as the apartment settled into an eerie silence, as it always did after a long day of watching people react to her footage online, she started to feel it. It was subtle at first, just an unsettling thought, a flash of memory, a shadow cast in the corner of her eye as she prepared for bed. The images on the video were so vivid, so real, that when she turned off the lights that night, she thought she heard something, a faint dragging noise. She froze. It was coming from the hallway. Claire strained her ears, her heart picking up pace. The air was thick, every beat of her pulse pounding in her head. Drag, scrape. It sounded like feet dragging across the floor. Slow, deliberate, as if someone was walking, someone heavy, someone who couldn't quite lift their legs properly. But her apartment was empty. There was no one in the hallway, she was sure of it. The dragging sound continued, drawing closer and closer. It stopped right outside her door. Claire slowly backed away from the bedroom door, her breath catching in her throat. The darkness beyond it suddenly felt colder than the night air had any right to be. Whisper. The softest of sounds filtered through the crack at the bottom of the door, like breathing, slow and guttural. Her mind raced, but there was no escaping what she knew. Whatever it was, whoever it wasn't an illusion. It wasn't just part of the video. It had followed them. It had followed her. And now, just like it had in Stonevale Memorial, it was waiting. The camera's final whisper had always been the most unsettling part, the silence that lasted long after everything had ended. Now Claire understood why she had brought the nightmare out with her, and no matter how far she ran, it would never let her go. Story 2. The Haunted Train Station. Mysterious passengers that vanish. The old, abandoned train station, on the outskirts of a quiet, forgotten village nestled in the folds of a mist-covered countryside, stood a train station like no other. The name on the cracked sign was nearly illegible, Mill Hollow Station. Once the pride of the region, it now looked like a relic from another time, far removed from the fast-moving world beyond the hills. Time had not been kind to the station. The paint on the rusting wheels flaked in lazy, peeling strips, and the brick walls, once pristine, had weathered into shades of dark, soot-like gray. Ivy crept up its columns like nature's slow reclamation, and the windows, long broken, stared like hollow eyes into the night. The station stood at the edge of the village, tucked away from the eyes of most who dared not venture near it. The heavy mist from the river lingered in the air, thick and unsettling. It seemed to seep into the very bones of the structure, as though it was part of the station itself, carrying with it an ancient, forgotten history. Even as the evening deepened, the fog clung stubbornly to the station platform, making everything feel damp and strange. If one stood there long enough, the world beyond would disappear. The sounds of crickets, the rustle of trees, even the soft murmur of distant voices seemed swallowed whole by the heavy curtain of fog. The only sound that dared disrupt the unnatural stillness was the occasional groan of wood and iron, as if the old station were coming to life, stretching and shifting with the weight of memories it could not cast off. And on nights like this, when the fog rolled in thick and unrelenting, there was an uncomfortable quiet that filled the station, deeper than mere abandonment. It was the sort of silence that spoke volumes. It was a silence that seemed to listen. Years ago, this very place had been full of life. The rattle of train wheels on tracks, the hurry of passengers pushing through the wooden doors of the station house, the chatter of travelers, the scent of freshly baked bread and hot tea from the little cafe that had once called the corner of the station home. These were the sounds that echoed in the memories of those who had passed by, never thinking they'd one day become nothing but whispers in the dust. Mill Hollow Station had seen its fair share of life, if only in fleeting moments, but now it was a monument to what had been and what would never come again. The train that had last departed from the station many years before would be remembered only by the handful of souls left to recall the tragedy. Few had bothered to speak of that night, when the last train had arrived and never left. Most of the older generation had shut their mouths tight at the mention of the station's past, fearing it best forgotten, as if acknowledging the event would reignite something best left in the shadows. The accident, wrapped in mystery and silence, had claimed the lives of passengers and crew alike, leaving no one behind to tell the tale. Most people who lived nearby, those still holding on to the past of a town that was quickly becoming obsolete, saw the station as nothing but a forgotten memory. They avoided the eerie stretch of track and the building that lingered beyond it, out of the corner of their vision. The younger generation, unaware of the history, merely regarded it with a morbid curiosity, but no one dared to cross that threshold. It was a place out of time, a place where the heartbeat of the world had ceased, where death unspoken still hung in the thick, damp air. Mill Hollow Station, which had once served as a lively stop between two bustling cities, had now succumbed to disrepair. The benches had long since been removed. The timetables, now faded and cracked, told a story that would never reach its ending. What was once a center of excitement and emotion, stories of reunions, goodbyes, adventures, and arrivals, had transformed into nothing more than a decaying shell, not quite forgotten by time, but clinging to its past in a way that kept it both visible and cursed, lost to the people who no longer wished to remember it. Yet as the fog crept steadily closer, brushing against the rotten walls and shifting shadows at the station's edge, it seemed as though the memories refused to stay buried. The station waited, forever still, but forever haunted by its past. Something in the air trembled with a lingering promise that the silence wouldn't remain peaceful for long. The legend of the lost passengers. The tragedy that befell Mill Hollow Station had occurred decades ago, but the remnants of its terror lingered like an uninvited guest, casting a shadow over the village. Late on a bitterly cold November night, the train had rolled into the station from the north, a reliable schedule for many, but not this time. The track had been obscured by thick fog, a dampness so oppressive it seemed to cling to the soul itself. Passengers, likely worn from the travels, had not suspected the lurking danger that awaited them. There was an odd stillness to the air, the kind that precedes storms, And it was then, at exactly 11:47 p.m., that disaster struck. The train was a rapid express, connecting distant towns with their bustling lives, running day and night through rain, snow, and wind. The passengers were mostly strangers to one another, townfolk returning home, tourists, and a handful of business travelers who had caught the last ride of the night. Unbeknownst to them, the fog had thickened unnaturally that evening, a malevolent force which made the track slippery and hard to navigate. The conductor, an experienced man well accustomed to the weather, had noticed something off, something that made him uneasy. In those final moments before the crash, the train shook violently as it rounded a bend just before the station. The force of the derailment splintered the once sturdy iron rails and twisted the steel of the wheels beyond recognition. Screams muffled by the fog filled the air, accompanied by the deafening screech of grinding metal that seemed to echo for miles in every direction. The train toppled like an iron beast forced off its path, hurtling violently to the ground, and then a disturbing, eerie silence followed, the kind that presses in on your chest and drowns out every other sound. There were no cries for help, no pleas for mercy, just the broken hissing of steam leaking from the twisted wreckage. When dawn broke, the village was stirred by the sight of the wreckage in the distance, bodies strewn across the field and the crumpled remains of the train like a monstrous carcass with no survivors. The local authorities searched the area relentlessly but found no trace of life. Not a soul remained. They cleared the debris quickly. After all, the dead were now forgotten. Those who had witnessed the aftermath carried their heavy burden of grief, but said little beyond the initial murmurs of horror. And just like that, life in the village moved forward, but the echoes of that night never fully dissipated. Yet, as the fog rolled in thicker with each passing year, so too did stories of the lost passengers that had perished so violently. The station, left standing in eerie silence, seemed to hold its breath, as though the memories of the tragedy had taken root within its walls. The station was now notorious for mysterious occurrences, whispers in the wind, faint laughter carried on the mist, and inexplicable sounds of footsteps echoing on the platform where no one stood. Those passing through on rare occasions would tell of unnerving sightings, shadows at the edge of the station, as if the spirits of the train's lost passengers were walking the platform in the fog, waiting. But always, just as quickly, these figures would vanish when the mist lifted or a stray beam of moonlight caught the emptiness. On nights when the air felt especially still, locals claimed to hear a chorus of low, plaintive voices murmuring softly through the thick fog. It was said that one could also hear the sound of faint crying, muffled and distant, as though it came from beneath the ground itself. Those with sharper ears could even pick out what sounded like passengers in conversation, speaking softly to one another from a time long past. No one could explain these bizarre occurrences, but they seemed to happen reliably when the fog set, thicker and the winds died down. The village had learned to brace itself for these mysterious nights, to listen in silent horror as the mist clouded the station and draped it in its perpetual gloom. More than once, a hiker or a wanderer passing by the station would claim to have seen the figures of people walking in the fog, travelers carrying bags as if waiting for a train, disappearing into the mist only to vanish without a trace. Those who lingered for too long reported a peculiar chill creeping into their bones, followed by an unsettling feeling of being watched. There were those who saw them waiting on the platform, patiently, as if their journey were far from over. Naturally, the older generations did not speak of the station with much enthusiasm. If questioned, their faces would go pale and they would swiftly change the subject. It's best not to go near it, they would say. Best leave the past undisturbed. The souls of the departed still roam, and no one ever returned the same from that place. Their words, delivered in hushed tones, painted a story of torment that no one could prove, yet many came to believe. If it weren't for the unwavering legends whispered from one to the next, the villagers would have simply avoided the station out of neglect. However, that was not the case. There was a deep unspoken belief that something supernatural still lingered, something unyielding that could not be easily dismissed. One day, a local historian, drawn to the unsolved mysteries surrounding the station, took it upon himself to research the tragic wreck and the aftermath. His findings were chilling. Further digging into historical records revealed an unusual detail that made his skin crawl. The passengers hadn't merely died from the accident. Several had vanished altogether in the days after the wreckage was cleared. No burial sites were marked, and the missing were never accounted for in the village's records. The historian, after years of studying local folklore, came to a dark conclusion. The passengers had never truly left. It was as if they were trapped, their souls suspended in an endless wait, waiting for the train that never came. Their spirits had remained tethered to that cursed spot, unable to move on, tormented by the tragedy they had experienced. And according to the historian, the whispers, the apparitions, the eerie sounds, they were not merely sightings or the tricks of the mind. They were cries for release. He warned the villagers, the station isn't just haunted, it is a place of limbo, where the souls of those lost passengers remain, lost, wandering. The curse is not broken, it's only waiting for someone to find it. Some heeded the warning, others chose to ignore it. But as the fog thickened each season and the chilling whispers of Mill Hollow Station continued to reach those who dared listen, the mystery, like the fog itself, remained, cold and unresolved. The arrival of the stranger. Lena Williams wasn't the kind of person to believe in myths or ghost stories, a young writer with an unwavering thirst for truth. She had spent the better part of the last few years researching forgotten places and obscure histories for her upcoming book. Her passion for uncovering the hidden narratives of abandoned locales and their spectral rumors had taken her to strange corners of the country, but nothing had piqued her interest quite like Mill Hollow Station. The station's dark past intrigued her. Rumors of haunted platforms, shadowy figures, and restless souls clung to the place like cobwebs. Yet as a skeptic, Lena found these stories easily dismissible. She didn't believe in ghosts or superstitions. To her, they were merely stories people told to explain what they didn't understand. What she was after was the truth, the facts behind the myths. And if she could somehow prove them wrong, she would. Mill Hollow Station had the perfect setting for a story that demanded investigation. When she first arrived in the small town, there was an undeniable air of desolation about the place. The streets were quiet, almost eerily so, with only a few local shops in operation. The small wooden buildings were weathered, their paint chipped and faded. The town appeared to have come from a different time, a place suspended in history, untouched by the modern world. Lena checked into the local inn, a charming, albeit slightly dated establishment on the town's main road. The innkeeper, an elderly woman with cautious eyes, welcomed her politely but with a reserved air. The whole place felt hushed, as though even the building itself had learned to keep quiet about the events tied to Mill Hollow Station. Still, Lena dismissed her misgivings as simple village conservatism. Not everyone in small towns was open-minded or curious about outsiders. As she ventured through town, her mission was clear. She intended to gather all the information she could for her investigation. She headed first to the local bookstore, hoping to find some old records, perhaps an account of the station's final days before the tragic train accident. The bell above the door jingled as she entered, and the scent of old paper and dust filled her nose. She made her way to the back of the shop, where a dusty collection of local history books and travel guides lay. The shopkeeper, a man with a thick white beard, looked up from behind the counter with a polite but guarded expression. "I'm hoping you can help me," Lena said, picking up a weathered book on the region's history. "I'm looking for information on the old train station here, Mill Hollow Station. I'm a writer, and I'm researching the local myths surrounding it." At the mention of the station, the shopkeeper's face visibly changed. His hand, which had been resting on a shelf, froze mid-motion before he cleared his throat. "Ah, the station." He trailed off, glancing at the door as if expecting someone to burst through it at any moment. "Not much to say about that place. Best to leave well enough alone, miss." Lena raised an eyebrow, already sensing that the stories weren't as easy to brush off as she had anticipated. "I'm not afraid of a few ghost stories," she replied, determined. "I just want to understand the history behind the station and what happened there." The shopkeeper hesitated, his eyes darting to the shelf in front of him. Then after a long pause, he shook his head. "I'd suggest you not waste your time. There's nothing but sorrow tied to that station. Many people left this town because of it. And don't make the same mistake." His voice had dropped to a low whisper, and he quickly added, "You'll not find the answers you're seeking, young lady. The fog has a way of hiding things." Without another word, he returned to his counter and busied himself with cleaning the surface, clearly signaling the end of their conversation. Lena's curiosity only grew, but she decided to leave the bookshop for now. She couldn't afford to get bogged down by unhelpful warnings from locals. Her next stop was the local diner, a small and dimly lit place with faded red booths and a persistent smell of coffee in the air. The waitress who greeted her had a polite but impersonal smile, and the moment Lena mentioned the station, the woman's eyes flickered in discomfort. Like many others before her, the waitress ignored the question as if it hadn't been asked, instead offering Lena a long list of dishes. "Sure you don't want the fish special?" the waitress asked, her voice a little too cheerful. Lena's persistence finally broke through the facade. She pressed on. "I heard there's been talk about Mill Hollow Station for years. Strange occurrences, lost passengers, things like that. What do you know about it?" The waitress shifted nervously, looking over Lena's shoulder as though someone might overhear. Her voice dropped to a near whisper. "Some things are better left alone," she said firmly, wiping down the counter as though it would somehow erase the conversation. "That station, it doesn't let go of you. If you plan on going there, you'd best be prepared." Lena noticed the change in the woman's tone, the subtle undercurrent of fear. Yet despite the repeated warnings and tense glances, she felt more determined than ever. The story seemed ridiculous, designed to frighten, and she had no intention of letting superstitions rule her investigation. By the time she returned to the inn, dusk had begun to settle over the quiet town. Lena spent the evening preparing for her visit to Mill Hollow Station. She packed a small backpack with a flashlight, a notebook, a camera, and a voice recorder. These were the tools of her trade, items that would help her document whatever was out there, whether it was fact, folklore, or something in between. The room in the inn was eerily quiet as she placed the equipment on the desk. Her mind swirled with anticipation. Despite the warnings, Lena was undeterred. The town could warn her all they wanted, but she wasn't going to be scared off by a collection of half-hearted stories. She could practically feel the history pulsing from the decaying walls of the station, begging for someone to finally tell its side of the story. She glanced out of her window, where the mist was already rolling in, blanketing the streets with an unfamiliar sense of anticipation. Tonight, she would go to the station, and she would uncover the truth, one way or another. The haunting begins. The cold breath of night clung to Mill Hollow Station as Lena Williams approached the platform, her footsteps muffled by the thickening fog. The railway tracks lay before her like veins of rusted iron, curling off into the inky darkness. A blanket of mist twisted over the once bustling station, weaving between the broken windows, the crumbling brickwork, and the sagging benches. The air felt thick with a quiet that bordered on unnatural, and the only sound was the distant gurgling of the river that ran behind the station. At first, Lena had to pause as a sense of awe, a mixture of intrigue and anxiety settled over her. This was it, the place she'd read about in hushed, cryptic tales, the very heart of the local legend. She had come to uncover the truth, but as the fog closed around her, Lena could feel something larger than mystery creeping into the atmosphere, a weight she hadn't expected to feel. The station was frozen in time, its tired, decaying exterior an enduring monument to days that no longer existed. The iron gates were rusted shut, the windows shattered, and the timetables long since faded. The benches lay crooked and neglected, as if waiting for passengers who would never come. The light from her flashlight flickered across the platform, casting long, distorted shadows, and Lena shivered despite the cloak of silence enveloping the place. It felt like a world apart. Time itself seemed to pulse in the stillness. Here, on this forgotten corner of the map, the clock had stopped many years ago, forever caught in the aftermath of that fateful night. She set down her backpack, retrieving her notebook and equipment methodically. Lena had come prepared, focused on documenting every detail, everything from the architectural ruin to the air's peculiar stillness. But as the wind whispered against the crumbling stone, she couldn't ignore the strange aura surrounding the place. The stories she had been told haunted the corners of her mind now, even as she methodically listed off her observations in the notebook. Weathered and cracked signposts, fractured light posts casting unsteady beams of light through the dense fog, and dark stretches of track, more rust than steel. Nothing but the sound of distant night creatures until a soft, strange scuff of a step echoed through the silence. Lena paused mid-sentence, her pen suspended in the air. The sound had come from somewhere close, near the far edge of the platform, where the shadows gathered. Slowly, Lena turned toward the sound, but there was no figure, no obvious source of movement. Her gaze darted across the empty space. The tracks hummed faintly in the silence, and there was nothing but the oppressive, otherworldly quiet. Perhaps it was the wind, she thought, continuing to write in her notebook. Still, the faintest unease prickled at the back of her neck as she strained her ears for any other unusual noise. But then it happened again. This time, the soft steps were closer, louder, a shuffle of feet. Lena's heart skipped, and the pen in her hand wavered for a moment before she forced herself to breathe slowly. Rationally, she thought it was the wind, or perhaps just her imagination playing tricks in the eerie stillness. Yet a persistent echo filled the air, footsteps, real and distinct, walking deliberately in the direction opposite her. Her eyes swept over the length of the platform again, though it remained empty. No person, no living thing moved in her line of sight. Lena tried to focus, but her pulse quickened as the sounds grew louder, closer, just as they had done moments ago, like a conversation brewing from somewhere on the edges of her perception. The voices were distant at first, whispers almost imperceptible over the thrumming of her own heartbeat. She craned her neck, straining to pick up a word, but it was unclear, indecipherable. The murmur seemed to dance just beyond her reach, curling in and out of her consciousness, impossible to pin down. The light from her flashlight flickered, casting strange, shivering shadows across the distant edges of the platform. Then there it was, a dark silhouette at the far end of the tracks, moving at a slow, measured pace. Lena blinked, then blinked again, but the shape vanished, just as quickly as she'd registered it. Yet she could swear her eyes hadn't tricked her. Something was here. Shaking her head, she began to steel herself. "Get a grip," she muttered under her breath. There was no such thing as ghosts. There were only stories, only superstition. But as the evening wore on, the sense of being watched never left her. Midnight arrived, like the slow unfurling of darkness itself. The weight in the air deepened, pressing around Lena as the fog thickened once more. She tried to focus on her notes, on the sensory data she needed to complete her documentation, but her attention repeatedly returned to the sounds she could no longer deny. Footsteps, whispers, faint laughter, echoes lost to the mist, and shifting shadows at the edge of her vision. It was then that it came. The shrill, mournful sound of a train whistle pierced the oppressive stillness of the station. Lena's heart leapt into her throat as the earth beneath her feet vibrated faintly. Her pulse quickened in anticipation. Had she heard that correctly? A light appeared in the distance, dim at first, but growing brighter. Just the faintest glow illuminating the mist beyond the station's gate. Something was coming. Lena stood frozen as an old vintage train emerged from the fog, a spectral, otherworldly train moving slowly along the track. There were no flashing lights, no engine noise, just the hollow, melodic whistle of its presence, a haunting sound that reverberated through the still air. She gaped at it, transfixed, until she noticed the eerie details. The windows were dark. There were no passengers inside, only silhouettes of people standing on the platform, figures in the mist, barely tangible, barely more than shadows of those long past. The figures moved as though they too were part of the mist, wraith-like, faceless, figures whose forms rippled like reflections in dark water. They flickered at the edges of her vision and then disappeared as quickly as they had appeared, leaving Lena straining to get a better look, to make sense of the nonsensical. And then one figure remained, a woman. She was standing near the edge of the platform, her back toward Lena, as though waiting for someone or something. Her skin was pale, almost translucent in the dim fog. Her dress, once elegant, now seemed tattered and torn at the edges. Her long, tangled hair cascaded loosely over her shoulders, and her posture was unnaturally stiff, as if her body had been frozen in time. Lena took a step forward instinctively, unable to help herself, her heart thudding wildly. She called out, her voice trembling despite her resolve. "Excuse me, are you—" But the woman didn't move. She simply stood there, the faintest trace of sorrow in her gaze as her eyes slowly turned to meet Lena's, eyes so deeply hollow and cold that Lena felt a shiver creep up her spine. Those eyes stared, unblinking, as if searching deep within Lena's soul. Then, as quickly as the train had appeared, it began to fade, dissolving back into the mist. The woman, along with the light and the other passengers, vanished into the fog, leaving the platform silent once more. Lena's breath hitched in her chest, her heart racing as if she had just crossed into another world, one that existed just beyond the veil. Her body shook with an inexplicable sense of unease, but her mind raced. Was it an illusion, a trick of the mist, or had she somehow crossed into that space between the living and the dead? All she knew for certain was that something had just shifted within the walls of Mill Hollow Station. Something had just crossed over, The descent into the mystery. The days that followed Lena's first encounter at Mill Hollow Station were filled with restless nights and troubled thoughts. Despite the fear that gripped her during her supernatural experience, curiosity and an insatiable drive to understand the truth ultimately overwhelmed her skepticism. The train that vanished, the shadows, the figures, they haunted her, even when she wasn't physically at the station. She couldn't shake the vision of that woman's hollow, desperate gaze or the way the train had seemed to materialize from the fog like a memory. Lena knew she had to go back. Her obsession deepened as she pieced together her experiences, her mind racing with questions. Why was she seeing these apparitions? Were they the lost souls of the train passengers eternally bound to this place? Or were they figments of her mind brought to life by the dread of the station itself? Was there a connection between the train crash and the ongoing hauntings? This time, Lena came prepared. She had researched ghost hunting equipment, picking up recording devices, thermal cameras, motion detectors, and other specialized tools designed to capture anomalies, tools that she had once scoffed at. Yet now, her determination to uncover the truth made the supernatural devices seem necessary, even crucial. The more she learned, the clearer it became. Her journey to unravel Mill Hollow Station's tragic tale had just begun, and every unanswered question pushed her deeper into a mystery she didn't understand. Lena arrived at the station just as the evening mist began to crawl across the platform, the moon barely visible behind a thick curtain of clouds. She could feel it again, the oppressive silence and the unnerving stillness that hung like a fog over the place. There was no sound, no activity in the town beyond. But tonight, Lena hoped that her equipment would reveal something the human eye alone couldn't see. The station appeared unchanged from the first night. The same rusting gates, broken windows, crumbling walls. The fog, however, seemed even thicker now, as if it knew she had come to search for something. She set up her equipment carefully along the platform. The thermal cameras hissed as they booted up, and she adjusted the dials on the EVP recorder to ensure it was ready to pick up any strange frequencies. She took a deep breath, the air filling her lungs with dampness and unease. Lena didn't know what to expect, but she was determined to press on. As part of her mental preparation, she began speaking aloud, hoping for some kind of communication. "Hello," she called, her voice surprisingly steady as it cut through the stillness. "My name is Lena Williams. I've come to learn your story. If there is someone here, please let me know." The faintest sound echoed back. It was like a low, drawn-out breath, carried by the wind and almost imperceptible, just a whisper, barely audible over the ambient sound of her equipment clicking and whirring to life. Lena stepped back, narrowing her eyes at the faint flashing of the thermal camera, which caught unusual fluctuations in temperature. She squinted into the misty distance, scanning for any movement. Everything appeared still, yet she felt it again, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. The hairs on the back of her neck prickled. Skeptical but unyielding, she asked again, louder this time, "Is there someone here who wants to communicate? Please show me your presence. Let me know you're real." Minutes passed in heavy silence, though the oppressive cold grew sharper around her. A shiver passed through her body as a voice crackled from the recorder, so faint, so distant, it was almost lost in the static. "Help me." Her heart leapt. Lena pressed the pause button, listening to the playback again in awe. "Help me." Her heart leapt. Lena pressed the pause button, listening to the playback again in awe. "Help me." The voice sounded desperate, too desperate, a plea from the other side. She thought it was just interference at first, but the more she listened, the clearer it became. The EVP had captured something, the beginning of a tragic story begging to be told. She replayed the audio in an attempt to get more context, but it was only then, as the cold enveloped her, that a strange sensation washed over her. The hairs on her arms stood up as the world around her began to shift. The light from her flashlight flickered uncontrollably, casting distorted shadows across the platform. Without warning, the air seemed to change. In a moment of sudden vertigo, Lena found herself thrust into a vivid vision, an overwhelming sense of displacement. The fog disappeared for an instant, replaced by the blinding headlights of an oncoming train. She could hear the shrill shriek of metal on tracks, the sickening groan of an engine failing. Her body was cold, unnaturally cold, and she was no longer alone. There were cries, screams, a moment of panic, disarray, and confusion. The pressure of the crash seemed to tear through her senses. She could see the smoke billowing, feel the crushing weight of what would come next. I'm going to die. The thought was hers, though not hers, coming from someone in the depths of panic. The vision was momentary, as if only a fragment had been thrust upon her, and it left her with an overwhelming sense of dread. Her heartbeat thudded in her chest as she gasped for air, reeling from emotions that hadn't been her own, but still felt so real. The station had come to life in that instant. The wreckage, the terror, the broken glass, as if she had shared the doomed fate of one of the passengers. Her hands trembled uncontrollably, and the sudden vision of terror only deepened the unsettling reality she was confronting. This was what the spirits felt before the accident. This was their despair. But why? Why was it all still here? Shaking her head to clear the disorienting flashback, Lena looked back at her equipment. She felt an overwhelming urge to leave, to flee the station. Yet her curiosity had not waned. Instead, it had deepened into a kind of fascination, bordering on obsession. She decided to return the next night, prepared to delve deeper. However, as the subsequent nights passed, she began noticing an unsettling pattern. The spectral figures started appearing again, but this time they seemed more solid, more tangible. Lena's attempts to capture images with her camera brought her clearer glimpses of the figures, the station's ghosts that wandered and waited. Each night they returned, some moved slowly across the tracks. Others stood stationary, watching the station as if waiting for the train that would never arrive. One particular night, Lena's heart skipped a beat when she saw him, a man standing near the edge of the platform, rigid and still. He was dressed in an old-fashioned conductor's uniform, pale skin illuminated by her flashlight. His eyes, though distant, stared intently at the station's clock. He seemed to wait for something to happen, unaware of Lena's presence or too focused to notice her. A cold, almost artificial presence filled the space between them. As she studied him, Lena tried calling out to him, but there was no response. The air felt thick, suffocating. Every instinct told her to run. This wasn't just an ordinary figure anymore. She was no longer the observer. She was becoming part of this world, this haunting that lingered between life and death. Moments later, the man vanished into the fog. By now, Lena understood. She was no longer observing this phenomenon at a distance. She was being drawn in. The boundaries between her world and theirs were growing ever thinner. As she ventured further, she became ever more entwined in her tragic, desperate existence. Mill Hollow Station had secrets waiting to be uncovered, but at what cost? Each passing night, the figures grew clearer, and Lena became part of the station's story. And with each visit, a deeper, chilling truth unfurled, whispering silently that Mill Hollow was more than just a place of death. It was a prison for souls lost between time, with no escape. The final confrontation, breaking the curse. Lena's mind spun with every revelation she uncovered about Mill Hollow Station. The mystery of the vanished passengers had only deepened, leaving her with more questions than answers. She had come to the station seeking a story, a tale of tragedy and death that she could write about to excite and intrigue her readers. But she had found much more than that. It was now clear to her that the hauntings at Mill Hollow weren't merely the result of some cursed train, but a consequence of something far more intricate and tragic. Souls in limbo, unable to move on because their story had been lost to time. The constant visits from spectral passengers, the ethereal train that glided through the mist, the silent conductor staring at an invisible clock. All these things were but pieces of an incomplete puzzle. And the final piece, Lena realized, lay hidden within the forgotten history of the accident that had turned Mill Hollow Station into a graveyard for the lost. As she pored over more local records and spoke to the oldest residents of the town, she began to piece together a horrifying truth about that fateful night. The train had not simply crashed, it had crashed for a reason. According to the most detailed account Lena could find, the tragedy was preceded by an odd, inexplicable event. A figure had appeared out of nowhere, a person who wasn't supposed to be on the train at all. It had been a foggy evening, much like the ones Lena had experienced herself at the station, the mist creeping thick and dense across the tracks. Among the last passengers boarding the train had been a woman, pale, confused, and speaking in disjointed words. She couldn't provide a name or origin, and the staff had grown weary of her mysterious, almost ethereal presence. By the time the woman arrived, the station was mostly empty, and the final preparations for departure were already underway. The train was then derailed, tearing through the tracks, with bone-shattering force, sending everything into chaos. But the curious part was that no one had seen this woman board the train. She had simply appeared, and shortly after the crash, her disappearance was just as strange. Though no body had ever been found at the scene, Lena was overwhelmed by a sick realization that this woman, the figure who had somehow become part of this tragic narrative, might be the key to breaking the curse. It was as though she had tethered the spirits of the station to the cursed train by her arrival, somehow drawing them into an endless looping nightmare. The spirits were forever bound to the train, to the tracks, to the relentless cycle of waiting for a journey that would never come. But Lena couldn't know why they continued to linger. They hadn't been given the resolution they needed, the closure the spirits desperately sought to find peace. No one had ever acknowledged the source of the torment. And that is where Lena came in. On the night Lena decided to confront the truth once and for all, everything felt wrong. The fog clung to the platform in ways she had never seen before. Thick and choking, impenetrable. Her flashlight shook in her hand, and even the equipment she had brought felt heavier than usual. It was as if the station itself was aware of her presence, bracing itself for the final interaction. There had been no more visions, no more audio recordings. This time, she was completely alone, surrounded by the deep silence and ghostly waiting. Yet Lena could feel something closing in on her from all sides. Something ancient, raw, and mournful. As she moved closer to the old clock, her eyes landing on the familiar figure, an old man dressed in the uniform of a conductor, she noticed something horrifyingly different. He was not just standing at his usual place now. The mist seemed to swirl around him as though it recognized his place in this endless ritual. But this time he was standing still, his face turned directly toward her. The intensity in his eyes was immediate. They were filled with sorrow and pain, but beyond that, they were knowing. Like a figure who understood that she, the one standing there now, was the final piece, the one capable of unlocking this nightmare. Lena froze as his lips barely moved, but she heard his voice clear as day, not in the air but in her head. Only the one who understands can free us. Her heart stopped for a moment. She took a step closer, and in that instant, the clock above the platform struck midnight. The atmosphere in the station seemed to intensify, as if the air had turned to lead. The strange, pulsating energy from the apparition of the conductor made her tremble. She could feel the pressure building. This was her final moment to do what she came to do, to understand and break the cycle. The conductor's pale eyes burned into her, seemingly willing her to understand, to make the connection between the woman who caused this chain of sorrow and the spirits trapped within the train. She could see him now more clearly, his figure somehow more solid, more vivid than any ghost she had seen before. In that moment, the station came alive, not with physical form, but with memories. Memories of the crash, the anguish, the man who tried to save the woman, the workers who had desperately tried to bring the wreckage to safety. They all clung to her perception as voices echoed from every corner of the platform. Whispers surrounded Lena, sounding like 100 cries for help, a cacophony of those who had never been laid to rest. "Break the curse," the conductor whispered again. She did not belong with them. She was not meant to be on that train. But it is not too late. You can save us. Tears welled up in Lena's eyes as she reached out toward him. She could feel the weight of their collective sorrow, the years of isolation and despair pressing down on her shoulders. Everything was clear now. In order for the souls to be released, the train station needed to acknowledge the cause of its curse, needed to accept that the woman, lost and confused, had been brought there by some other force. She had arrived too early and too mysteriously, had set off a chain of events that had led to a wreck of unfathomable scale. The sacrifice she made had inadvertently tethered everyone to this place, and for these spirits to escape, they needed to forgive her for not having the chance to mourn, to put their tragedy to rest. Only then could the endless cycle of waiting and torment cease. Without further hesitation, Lena spoke aloud, making her peace with the past. "I understand now," she whispered to the conductor, the woman, and the other spirits. "I understand the pain of waiting for something you'll never have. But you are not trapped. You are not forgotten. Your story will live on." The words echoed, the station's final cries dying away. And in an instant, the temperature around Lena warmed, the dense fog that had enveloped the platform lifting. The light of the moon broke through the clouds, washing the station in a soft glow. The atmosphere that had been heavy, oppressive, and sorrowful now settled into something serene. Then the figures slowly began to dissipate, their forms fading into the mist. The sound of the eerie train whistle no longer echoed in the night. All that remained was an air of deep peace, as though the spirits were no longer waiting. Lena stood there for what seemed like an eternity, watching the mist dissipate and the station calm into an eerie but peaceful silence. The curse had been broken. The souls were no longer bound to this place, waiting endlessly for a train that would never come. When she finally turned to leave, the station seemed to bow to her in a final gesture of release. She knew that the history of Mill Hollow Station had been rewritten that night, not by her, but by those souls who had now found their rest. And though Lena would leave that station with a story to tell, it was not one of horror, but one of hope. The tale of an abandoned place, reclaimed by the forgotten souls, freed at last from the weight of their unyielding grief. The aftermath. Lena left Mill Hollow Station with a heavy heart and a mind full of new insights. The night of her final encounter had altered her in ways she hadn't expected. It was one thing to study legends, to explore ghostly myths with skepticism and a researcher's distance, but quite another to witness the power of an unfinished story and the lives that clung to it. The town itself felt different now. When she returned to her room at a small rustic inn, she noticed a shift in the atmosphere. The oppressive heaviness she had grown so accustomed to in Mill Hollow, those days filled with eerie whispers and mysterious glances, had lifted, replaced by a calmness she'd rarely noticed before. The air was lighter, as though some invisible weight had been relieved, not just from the station, but from the entire village. For the first time since she'd arrived, people greeted her in the street without hesitation. The unease that had once closed their hearts was gone, replaced by a quiet acceptance of what had transpired. The lingering fear that had clung to the town's residents seemed to have evaporated, though no one dared mention the station openly. It was as though an unspoken understanding had settled over everyone. What had been lost had finally been found, and the curse had been lifted. Lena's book began to take shape in the days that followed. It started as a documentary-style recounting of the abandoned train station, a thorough investigation into the strange events she had witnessed. But as she wrote, the story evolved into something much deeper, something more personal, reflective, and soulful. She realized that the true essence of the book wasn't just about the station or the ghostly figures. It was about the souls that remained behind, waiting, lost in time. Her story became a memorial to their tragedy, a testament to the unacknowledged grief that had bound them to the earth for so long. As she finished the manuscript, Lena felt a quiet satisfaction. She had not only uncovered a mystery, but had, in her own way, brought peace to those who had been trapped between life and death. The narrative was no longer solely about horror, but about empathy, closure, and the power of storytelling itself. However, as Lena prepared to leave Mill Hollow for good, her peace was marred by a final unsettling encounter. One night, just days before her departure, she stood at the station, reliving the ghostly encounters she'd had months ago. The fog rolled in once more, thicker than she remembered, curling around the old platform with an eerie familiarity. She thought she had seen the last of the figures, the conductor, the pale woman, the lost souls waiting on the platform. The station was peaceful now, but as she turned to leave, a distant whistle, faint but unmistakable, sliced through the quiet. It was as if the air itself held its breath. Lena turned her head slowly to see, just out of the corner of her eye, a shadow, distinct yet fleeting, move along the far end of the platform. It was nothing more than a flicker, a dark form against the mist, watching from afar, waiting in the silence. Her heart pounded in her chest. The shadow seemed to acknowledge her presence, almost as if giving one last sorrowful farewell before retreating into the night. The station, now calm, would remain quiet once again for a time, but something in Lena's chest told her that some mysteries were never fully laid to rest. With one final lingering glance, Lena left Mill Hollow behind. The journey had concluded, but the station, with its shadows and its whispers, would never truly leave her.